I believe that Shanann Watts murdered her two children. I believe that with about 70% certainty. I think that Chris instantly retaliated once he found out, and that is why Shanann ended up dead. And I think that the reason she didn't have any, I think the reason Chris didn't have any wounds on him was because she was already suicidal and already wanted to die. The reason I've come to this conclusion is because I have done a lot of research, not into this case, but into other cases. Not into this case because I think it's through context that we can best understand how difficult cases can be solved. What I've done is I have gathered a collection of models from other cases and from other fields of psychology and criminology. I've gathered these models of human behavior that we have examples of in other cases and in the population in general. So a model of human behavior is like an emotion. It's a pattern of behavior that's well understood by psychology, or it is a type of crime, or it is a medical condition. Those models are right here. I believe that the entirety of the mystery of the Chris Watts case can be solved by combining these well-known, well-understood models of human psychology and of human behavior. I think that the other theories that try to explain this mystery fail because they do not use models that are well understood. They don't use models that we have numerous examples of happening elsewhere. What I've done here is I've made sure that every action that I claim has been taken by an individual in this case, I can look back and say there are either dozens or hundreds or thousands or millions or even billions of other people who have felt this exact same way, or who have done this exact same thing for this exact same reason. If you are going about studying this case by saying, let me look at this case in a vacuum, look at all the tiny details of this case, and try to come up with a way this might have happened, if you look at it in a vacuum, the likelihood of coming up with a model for human behavior that is not consistent with the general population, that is not consistent with statistics, that is not consistent with the reality of how humans actually operate, then you are probably going to end up with a nice conclusion that looks nice, that people like, but is not factually correct. What this is about is finding out what the easiest way for solving this mystery is, and this is the easiest way. So, one word that I haven't heard discussed much at all, if at all, in this case, is the word limerence. Limerence is a word that some people use to describe the way you feel about someone typically of the opposite gender that is extremely romantic. It happens extremely quick, and you become all consumed by your passion for this individual. Sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's not. A limerent affair is what I think Chris had for Nicole Kessinger. It is an extremely common thing that happens a lot. It's very well understood, and it causes all of the behavior that you saw in Chris. All of his feelings for Nicole Kessinger, all of his apathy towards his family, all of his apathy towards Shanann, is all explained by Limerent Affair. If you want to learn more about Limerent Affairs, you can check out Marriage Helper, and there's another channel, another YouTube channel that I will link below that has a lot of great resources on to help you understand what a Limerent Affair is, what limerence is, how it works, what it looks like. And I think you will find that Chris's behavior in this mystery, in this case, is extremely consistent with this very well understood phenomenon of human behavior. So next we have cluster B pathology. This is a DSM classification. Cluster B is a cluster of personality disorders. The reason I bring up cluster B pathology is not because of Chris, but because of Shanann. I think that Shanann's behavior, as documented in the discovery, is very consistent with a wide range of cluster B personality disorders. There are about 4 that I've identified as the most likely. I think she has a lot of characteristics of a lot of these personality disorders. I don't think there's evidence to suggest that she would be clinically diagnosed with any of these disorders because of lack of information, and obviously we can't do clinical interview. But there is quite a bit of evidence that she was in the subclinical category and that she leaned some ways, some more than others. And what I concluded at the end of my investigation was that she is mostly on one particular disorder, and that's for a specific reason that I'll get into later. But generally speaking, she is very much in line with cluster B tendencies in general as a broad container. So that is important to understand. So fear of abandonment. That is commonly associated with borderline personality disorder. That is a cluster B in here. Fear of abandonment. Everyone experiences this, right? Nobody wants to be abandoned by someone they love, right? When someone who has borderline personality disorder or has a lot of symptomatology consistent with specifically borderline personality disorder, we might talk about fear of abandonment as a clinical term, as a clinical problem that needs to be solved clinically. So fear of abandonment is not someone experiencing this clinical form, this clinical variation of fear of abandonment responds to perceived or real, or perceived, imagined, or real abandonment by a close attachment figure. They perceive this as, it is the end of the world, I am going to literally die. That is how these people experience abandonment, by a close attachment figure, especially their primary attachment figure. When someone who they are very close to this way, when that person either says they are going to leave, or when the person experiencing this suspects that they might leave, the person experiencing this literally feels like they're going to die. That is what that is like. That is what is meant by this. So we have Shanann, who demonstrates a lot of cluster B pathologies. We have a Limerent affair that is going to interact directly with this fear of abandonment, right? Because Chris is having the Limerent affair, he is abandoning Shanann, and because of my analysis, I determined that Shanann is reacting to certain stimuli in a way that we would expect someone with borderline personality to react. So a test you can do to try to get a better idea of what specific personality of cluster B someone is by asking what happens when they are abandoned. The person with narcissistic personality disorder says, "How dare you? You don't get to leave me." The person with dependent personality disorder is most likely to immediately find someone else to replace the figure. Someone with borderline personality disorder is more likely to self-destruct and panic and feel like they're going to die, literally. It's a very primal fear that is activated when the abandonment happens, or when it might be about to happen. So we have these three things interacting with each other. And then I can't get to all the details in this video, but one of the most important factors is sleep deprivation on the night of, or the early morning of, the murders. Sleep deprivation, we understand that very well. It has obviously a very significant impact on decision making. That is not trivial. We know that it was very early in the morning. That doesn't necessarily mean that she had less energy. But it seriously puts into question decision making. And to be fair, it also puts into question Chris's decision making, not just Shanann's. But since we have 1, 2, 3 things already building up for Shanann, that is number 4. And then the fourth thing, we have end of the world. This is a human experience of everything that I've built in the last 3, 4, 5 years is literally about to burn to the ground because this one thing is happening. Shanann is in deep with the company Lavelle, which sells the brand Thrive, and her job with that company requires her to not have a divorce. She will lose an insane amount of income if she ends up in a divorce, because she is a very public figure. Not so much public, but a very what's the word? She's very out there. She's not necessarily public, but she's on social media a lot. Everyone knows all of her family habits. Everyone, she's very much out there, and if she goes through a divorce, everyone's going to know. That's going to severely deteriorate her income, because it is an extremely social work. The work is extremely social. And she's already at the brink of bankruptcy because of, we don't really know why, but we can suspect that it's because of her spending habits, which may or may not be because of Lavelle. But we have good reason to believe that she was very close to bankruptcy at that time. And we also have the declined credit card that early that morning that was most likely she was aware of in the moments leading up to the murders. So we have someone who is at the end of their rope in Shanann. That leads us to maternal filicide. That is what I believe happened. Now, maternal filicide is not as well understood as a lot of these other things that I've talked about. These other things that I've talked about, the most rare borderline personality disorder is experienced by what is said to be about 1% of the population. Maternal filicide is obviously much more rare. It is when a mother kills a young child, her own young child. Young children, when murdered, are very, very likely to be murdered by a close family figure, such as a parent. So even though maternal filicide is rare, we do have a lot of examples of what it looks like. And what it looks like is a mother or a father. It's usually about 50-50. It's not more often than not mothers. It's not more often than not fathers. It's basically 50-50. You have a parent, I'll say, who is driven to kill their children for 6 or 7 different reasons. One of the top ones is altruism. They believe that their world has broken so far apart that their children are going to suffer if they continue to live. And so the altruistic motive for maternal filicide says, I'm going to kill them because if I don't, they're going to suffer a lot more than they would otherwise. That's the altruistic motive. There's also the revenge motive. This is when the murdering parent says, because my spouse is leaving me, is causing me this much pain, I am going to murder their child and my child in order to cause them more pain so that they understand how much I'm hurting. That is the spousal revenge motive. There are a few other motives, but those are the 2 key motives. Now, to be clear, the spousal revenge motive is much more rare than the other motives, but we also have altruistic motive, which I think most likely played a key role in this case, and I think the spousal revenge motive may have also played a role in this case, specifically due to things that Chris said that may or may not have been true. Then we go to shame. Now we're talking about Chris. The murders have happened, and what has happened is Chris caught Shanann committing maternal filicide because of all of these things that were going on. Okay. He immediately retaliates without having any time to listen to the inner voice of humanity. That's a legal term. He retaliates instinctively because he just saw this woman. Doesn't matter what woman it is. He just saw a woman, a human. He just saw an attacker murdering both of his baby girls. Now, a distinction made in the interrogation video, a distinction that the investigators made was, did he kill Shanann because he thought one of the daughters might have still been alive, or did he kill Shanann as retaliation? And he said he already thought that both girls were dead, and he killed Shanann in retaliation. That's important because if you were prosecuted for that crime of killing Shanann in retaliation, it's important to know, well, was it in defense of his daughters or was it retaliation? So if you ever wondered why they asked him that, that's why. So after this, Chris has 3 dead bodies in his house, and he needs to figure out what to do. Shanann is an extremely open figure. Everyone always knows where she is. She's constantly on her phone. She's constantly on social media. As soon as the sun comes up the next morning, Chris probably has an idea that people are going to be looking for her because she's always on her phone. If she's suddenly not on her phone, Chris knows that people are going to come knocking. People don't really think about that, but he probably didn't expect it to happen that soon. But anyone with an IQ of 10 probably could have figured out that someone who is that active on social media and on her phone, people are going to come knocking very quick. So Chris can't just leave the bodies there because he knows people are going to come snooping around because people are constantly in his house. Shanann constantly has visitors. So he has to get rid of the bodies, right? What's he going to do? Call the police? He knows all 3 of them are dead. Or at least he believes that. He can't give CPR to people of that size anyway. They're too small. When you get CPR training at work, or at least when I go to get CPR training at work, you don't get trained on infants, right? You don't know how much pressure to apply. I don't either. People have given him crap for this, but it's true for me. When I used to work out on construction sites and on tree trimming crews, they taught us how to give CPR to an adult, but they didn't tell us how to give CPR to a small child. It's different. If you've never been trained to do it, you're not going to know how to do it. So he can't give them CPR. Can he call the police? Can he call an ambulance in order to try to rescue them? Yes, But psychologically, I don't think so. Because what's it going to look like? And also, shame. He's feeling shame right now because this is his fault. Also, Chris is feeling fear right now. What is this going to look like? What are they going to say? What are they going to think when they come to my house? I'm completely fine. There are no wounds on my body. And yet here are 3 dead bodies inside my house. And I have a mistress. What's that going to look like? So fear tells Chris, don't call the cops. They're already dead. There's nothing you can do to help them. Don't call the cops. You're going to wind up in prison the rest of your life. This doesn't look good for you at all. So what does Chris do? Well, he most likely tries to hide the bodies the best he can. Now you might say, well, when he loaded the bodies up in the truck, he didn't look frantic. He didn't look scared. He didn't look panicked. But this is another element of the story. Dissociation and derealization. These are responses to trauma. What Chris would have just experienced was an extremely traumatic event. These are responses to trauma. Dissociation is a way of just completely disconnecting from the traumatic event. This happens because the brain does not have time to process the traumatic event. It delays the processing of that traumatic event. So the person experiencing dissociation appears completely fine, completely normal. Nothing happened. This is not malicious. This is not evil. This has no connection to morality at all. Sometimes this can look the same way it does when this is malicious, when this is apathy, when this is just psychopathy, basically. But dissociation can look very similar to that, but it is a very different thing. It is the brain not being able to cope, so the brain delays the processing, and the brain goes into autopilot. The other component of that is derealization. Derealization is when you feel like the world isn't real. Chris talked about this in the media interviews, or at least one of them. He said, nothing even feels real right now. That is a testament to derealization. When you process, or when you experience a traumatic event, and when you're experiencing dissociation, when you're in autopilot, your perception of this experience can oftentimes feel unreal because this is an altered state of consciousness. The world doesn't feel real. You feel like you're living in a dream. These are all things that Chris said. This is very well understood in the field of psychology. This model perfectly explains his behavior, given all of this, given that he did not murder his children, given that he did not premeditate any of these crimes before that morning. So then we get to guilt. Well, if Chris didn't do this with malice, and if he didn't premeditate all this, and if he didn't kill his kids, then why did he confess to it? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do have about 12 possible reasons that happened, and the chief of which is guilt. And only one of those reasons has anything to do with the truth of what happened that morning. The other 11 have absolutely nothing to do with the truth. Guilt. Why would Chris feel guilt? Chris would feel guilt because all of these events took place because of Chris. If Chris hadn't gotten into this affair, if he had not emotionally abandoned Shanann, if he had not said whatever it is he said that morning, this would not have happened. His girls would still be alive. Shanann would still be alive. Chris feels guilty for all of this. He thinks this is all his fault. He thinks that he is the worst possible father on the planet. Not because he murdered his children, because he didn't, but because something that he did indirectly got them killed. He feels guilty. And this guilt probably would feel a lot less bad if he owned up to Shanann's crimes. If he does a good deed by making it so that the world doesn't have to go through a trial, if he takes the blame for something he didn't do, he will feel better inside because he did a good deed. This is his way of coping with the guilt. By accepting someone else's responsibility, by accepting Shanann's responsibility. Part of him might not even feel like he deserves to be out on the outside. He probably doesn't. He probably feels like he deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life, regardless of who killed who or why. It doesn't matter. When you were a father and your children die and you're the reason, and when your wife dies and you're the reason, even if you're not the direct reason, you are going to feel immense guilt. And that guilt can lead you to some very scary places. And that guilt doesn't necessarily have anything to do with who physically caused the physical death of Bella Watts, who physically caused the physical death of Celeste Watts, and under what circumstances did Chris Watts strangle Shanann Watts. In the law, these things matter, but to guilt, those things don't matter. So these are the models, and I'm going to save this one for last. Maternal filicide. This is the most difficult one for people to accept because this is the crux of the whole case. Who killed the girls? Was it Chris? Was it Nicole Kessinger? Was it Shanann? Nobody really thinks it was, but could it have been? Maybe. Remember when I said that there are some examples of maternal filicide, even though it is a very rare thing? Let me end this by reading their names. These women killed their children under circumstances very similar to the circumstances that Shanann was experiencing the morning of those murders. Carol Coronado, Kelly Murphy, Brandy Worley, Amber Pastor, Jessica Smith, Jessica Eden, Suzanne Simpson, Dee Perez, Tess Rover, Jennifer Berman, Svetlana Laurel, Sherry Schurmeyer, Gina Summers, Nina Abukov, Amy Hall, Christy Sheets, and Connie Foster. Those women murdered their children, and they were prosecuted for it. Those women murdered their children.